So this is another episode of Bookseller in the Wild, and today we are outside the Morgan Library, one of the great repositories of rare books in the world. And it's a chilly New York morning before they open. So what are we doing outside the Morgan Library? Well, a lot of times people come to me, sometimes in an accusatory tone, and they see a 15th century book or a 16th century book, and they say to me, "Why are you in possession of this book? What are you doing with this? This book belongs in a museum." But there's the question, of course, how do these books get into the museum? And of course, this is a book selling channel, and that is where booksellers come in. Because one of the great roles of a rare bookseller is really finding rare material and shepherding it into an important cultural institution. And similarly, institutions, if you go into the rare book-selling field, really form the lifeblood of a lot of sales for rare booksellers. So I thought we would go in and talk to a curator in the Morgan Library about the interaction of a library or an institution with a bookseller. I use this as an example, more generally for institutions. Now, as I said, the Morgan Library is one of the greatest libraries in the world. The nucleus of the collection was formed by J.P. Morgan all the way back in the 1890s. He collected rare books and manuscripts and autographs and old master drawings. And the collection grew so large and so important that by 1924, his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., or Jack Morgan, took his private collection and transformed it into a public collection and institution, and probably one of the greatest charitable gifts to the arts and humanities ever, maybe even the sciences, because, you know, with all these AI bots sucking up data everywhere, probably one of the last secret sources for data are going to be the rare books in a library like this. So there's a Hollywood movie in the making for you right there. So if you haven't visited the Morgan Library, you should run to Expedia right after this video. Head to New York City, because especially for booksellers on that list of 1,001 places you should visit before you die, it's way up at the top. So an incredible institution, and let's go inside and talk to one of the curators. We are here in the East Room of the gorgeous Morgan Library, and I'm sitting here with one of the curators, John McQuillen. Thank you, first of all, so much, John, for doing this video. And I really, like I said, wanted to talk about how bookselling interacts with institutions like this. And the Morgan is one special institution, but hopefully it will be representative of the larger interaction with institutions and the bookselling world. But before we get into discussing that interaction, I have to have some introduction from John. So give us, first of all, a little background about yourself, how you came to the Morgan, when you came, how did you land this unbelievable envy-invoking position as a curator in one of the great institutions in the world?
I began in art history thinking I wanted to do medieval architecture, which growing up in the US, there's not a lot of medieval architecture in the US, but landed sort of a campus job at a rare book library when I was doing my master's degree in Dallas. And it was from that point when the curator was sort of like, don't be a fool, work on books, don't work on architecture, because they are all around you and they are here. And it's the material we have from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance that is the most prolific in this country. And I started out in medieval manuscripts.
That was at the Bridwell?
That was at Bridwell Library at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And the curator there at the time, Eric White, who's now at Princeton, who clearly is sort of a Gutenberg and incunable specialist, once he sort of introduced me to the world of early printed books, I was done. I was like, this is it. This is my home now. And then went on and did a PhD in art history and book history at the University of Toronto, but focusing on early printed books and sort of late medieval libraries when printed books joined manuscripts on library shelves. Right about the time I was finishing my PhD and getting ready to defend my dissertation, the job at the Morgan opened up.
What year was that?
2012. And so I feel like it was, right about the time of kind of turning the dissertation in and being done that I got an email from the Morgan saying, "We hear you're a specialist in early books and we're looking for a curator." I defended my dissertation and the next week moved to New York City.
That's fantastic.
And began here in October of 2012.
Wow, so we're already going on 13
Yeah.
years.
Oh my gosh. And then have spent these last 13 years, working on the collection, learning about it, and getting to play in this fantastic room.
Wow. So your department then is officially what?
We're the Department of Printed Books and Bindings. We begin with Gutenberg, basically, and go to the 21st century, but we also have a specific collection that's just bookbinding history, also from 15th, 16th century to the present day.
As I said, this is about booksellers sort of understanding the Morgan. So give me a little background then about maybe the administrative structure of the Morgan, because you have a wide breadth of collecting. It's not only early printed books here.
The kind of original core of the collection that began under Pierpont Morgan and Belle de Costa Green is medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, printed books and bindings. We also have a department of literary and historical manuscripts. And those are sort of the three core bound volume departments, typical traditional sort of library material. There's also a department of drawings and prints that focuses on old master work largely. And then a department of printed and music manuscripts. And then two more recent departments we have are modern and contemporary drawings and a department of photography, which have been added kind of in the last 20-ish years to kind of expand and reflect current trends in collecting and related material that kind of would have been part of the original Morgan Library, but has sort of grown and developed into that area.
I remember years ago when you had that exhibition on seals, that exhibition said to me, everything an exhibition should be, and it's probably what the Morgan does best, because it was small, it was focused. It wasn't one of these roller coaster exhibitions where you see too many objects and can't absorb it all, but it told the story of how the Eastern art made its way into Romanesque and medieval designs.
It's interesting how sort of gallery space kind of helps create your exhibitions. And so much of what, at least curatorially, we do here is create exhibitions to kind of activate the collection for visitors, since 99% of the collection is sitting on shelves where you really can't see it. And since we don't have huge exhibition galleries, the rooms are, smaller, which is kind of limiting, but then also allows us to be incredibly focused at times. And we have the options, depending upon the topic and what the curator needs to say or wants to say in the material, to kind of bring attention very closely into an object, but then also in a larger gallery then provide greater historical context for something. So we have, that option here depending on what the material really needs.
Yeah, I would imagine, obviously, the collection has changed in what you purchase over the years, naturally. It's no longer the case where Belle de Costa Green could present you with a William Caxton, which was probably, I think, one of the most expensive early purchases the Morgan ever made.
Yeah.
But those books generally don't exist. They're not available anymore. I mean, there are treasures, of course, to be found, but not anywhere close to the treasures you could find a century ago.
Yeah.
So that probably forces a change in the type of material you buy. But there's also, of course, trends and changes in the world of scholarship and bookselling and the general community for museums that I see. Curators look for things like annotations in books, how the early modern reader interacted with early books. For instance, sometimes there's underrepresented things in the collection, whether they're underrepresented voices or underrepresented materials.
Yeah.
How have you seen during your time here those trends shift in terms of what the Morgan collects?
It's interesting because particularly, for something like early books, the Mallory, the Caxton Mallory that Bell got at auction from the Robert Hoe sale, is a beautiful book, but there are no reader annotations. It's a fairly clean copy. And at one point, that was the height of collecting. We want to have copies that are pristine, that look like the day they came off the printing press, which for an incunable, something printed in the 1470s or 80s, if it is still that pristine 500 years on, that's a little bit of a red flag as well. You're like, how did this book last 500 years and there's no hint of anyone ever actually looking at it? We want to see personal interaction. Book from the 1480s, there's kind of a 19th century English handwriting in the margin. We don't know who that is. Is that a man? Is that a woman reader? Is that a child? A lot of doodles and scrawls that are in books always were like, oh, and like children got it. This is children's notations. And it's like, well, but also thinking back even 100 years, adults were illiterate and just learning to read and write in adulthood. So what we would call like a childish scrawl could still be from someone in their 30s.
Yeah, of course.
And so at some of these, just like understanding that individual, the people behind the
it's much more democratic understanding
copy.
of the...
Yeah, and not, maybe trying to talk about it in like a broader context and not just sort of throwing things away like, oh, and this little doodle was by a child. And you're like, but it was still an interaction, so.
I've had a lot of interaction with curators over the years. And one thing I notice is when a curator changes at an institution, their collecting interests change. Sometimes I'll be working with 5 to 7 years, I'm making good sales, everything is all hunky-dory, they change the curator, I have to grunt because it means restarting a relationship and understanding what they're after.
Yeah.
How do you feel when you came into this role 13 years ago, you left your personal mark in terms of what you wanted to do or how you've developed the collection? That differs perhaps from what the Morgan traditionally did.
We were always, I think, very strong in kind of French and Italian Renaissance books. I'm a little bit more of a Northern European kind of guy. And so, while, Italian things can be very nice, I'm looking more towards Germany, the Netherlands, France and England in the 16th century. And so, we're already very strong in Italian, so like, I can focus on that part of the collection.
And you had a focus on the Reformation at some point.
I did an exhibition with a number of institutions in Germany on Martin Luther's Reformation. That was at for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And so like, my interest is then a little bit more Germanic than what the Morgan has maybe typically been over the last several generations. And we have an entire bookcase up on the 3rd floor of kind of Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon material that Morgan bought in somewhere about 1899, 1900. Every single pamphlet, and there are several dozen, newly rebound by Riviere in London, same binding, same kind of portrait of Luther on the cover, all rebound for Morgan. And so like any note of like history that would have originally been in that copy completely washed away.
Yeah.
But that idea of collecting the important texts, but the kind of history of what that set of leaves printed with words on it, the history of that was not really as much important at the time.
How do you go about sourcing rare books and manuscripts from the rare book selling community?
I think kind of first and foremost is actually talking to booksellers. And there seem to be a lot of librarians and curators who are somewhat leery of the commercial trade. And I don't know why they think collection development should be a secret. And so it is, I think this very strong collaboration between collections, libraries, and commercial bookselling, so that people know what you're looking for. Like, it shouldn't be a secret.
So a bookseller has brought you a book. You're all gung-ho to purchase this. It's going to be fabulous in exhibit. Give me a little insight into the acquisition process. You just say, I'll take it? Do you have a board meeting?
I would love to just say I'll take it. But we do have, there's paperwork, there's a form to fill out. that on our side, basic copy description, and then a number of fields to fill out to how this is related to the collection, how this is important, filling out, basic information, finding price comparisons either for whatever this copy, if it has its own sale history, or copies of the same edition or related, however, to provide sort of a basis for understanding the given price by the book dealer. And then that goes to our director for approval. And so that's sort of the final authority. If it's over a considerable amount, up towards 6 figures, then we do have a kind of collections committee from our board of trustees that then, for major acquisitions, that has to be approved. But mostly it is just sort of between curator, department head, and then the director.
So it's good to know you're fiscally responsible and check prices. It's very similar to other collectors, because you might have an imagination that some people might have an imagination that institutions just say yes to a certain price, but they do check to make sure things are fair.
And to provide some understanding, for as much as the director knows about the art world and the book world, not aware, and every librarian is not aware of like the price history for every book. So we have to do our due diligence to find out, is this price justified and fair by what the book dealer has brought us, or are there questions where it's like, okay, 2 years ago, a copy of this edition sold for $5,000 and you're asking like 25. Like, why is it worth this much? Like, and then you see, oh, it has like this provenance, there's special features, Sure. And then you're like, okay, now, we can then validate, on our own side why the price is necessary.
One of the things that I think about rare booksellers and their interaction with curators, except for the monetary aspect we're selling, and of course you're buying, is in many ways we're allied spirits. Rare booksellers are looking to discover things. I mean, that's the joy of bookselling. And in many ways, it's also the joy of being a curator, because not only are you purchasing, but you're also mining the great wealth that's here of sometimes books, like you say, have sat on the shelf for decades. Nobody's examined from a modern perspective. So can you think of something perhaps that you've enjoyed discovering yourself?
Oh, goodness. One of the multiple projects that I sort of work on here when I can do sort of collection maintenance and just like go play in the vaults and look at books, is going through our entire incunable collection. Our catalog records for the incunables were very sparse. A very basic library record that shows the edition might have a binding description, but kind of traditional printed book records didn't really delve deeply into copy specifics. And so what I'm going back through now and doing is then adding all that information on hand decoration, whether it's illumination or rubrication, any kind of annotations anywhere in the volume, both from marginal notes that try and kind of bring out keywords or explain something in the text, to when I can kind of identify what it is and write a good description, other booksellers' notes that are on the paste downs or in leaves, and a full provenance history, where before, for at least the Morgan, the provenance that was recorded was, this Duke's collection, this library, this Prince's library, very well known, typically the world of white male European book collectors. But what I'm finding is there are so many more traces of provenance in the volumes that are just handwritten purchase or donation inscriptions, that whether because they were sort of an unknown person or they just couldn't read the handwriting, it never got recorded. So a lot of these, are now coming up into the collection, where even if I can't identify it, I can sort of transcribe the inscription. So if you're searching on Google and find something similar, it'll help researchers find the material. And so one of the, I guess, kind of more recent, it wasn't even recent. Goodness, it was now like 2015, but I still get excited about it. In one of our 3 copies of the Gutenberg Bible, the one that's kind of on view here in the East Room, the record for all that before never really, it said it had like early decoration, and that's as far as it went. But they're very nice, blue and red, kind of painted initials. There's no gold or figural decoration, but that decoration is specific to a single monastery outside of Worms, Germany, this monastery called Kirchgarten, which was destroyed in the 1520s. So it had a very short life when it had its Gutenberg Bible and decorated it. But there's only a couple of other books left from that monastery that have this same kind of decoration. And so, you see the decoration, it was produced in the monastery, so now like that ties our Gutenberg Bible back to this monastery as well, and that was not known until 5, 6,
wow,
not even 10 years ago. And so there's still, even on something that is looked at as much and talked
sure,
about as much as a Gutenberg Bible, there are still discoveries to be made.
I like to ask that question to curators because when I see them light up and explain, about the decoration, as you said, in the Gutenberg Bible, it puts in the back of my mind, if I find a book with some sort of interesting aspect to the decoration, that's something I can highlight and bring to your attention. It's immediately going to make a connection because that's what you're interested in.
Yeah. And, a generation ago, hand decoration in books was not really something that was a plus. Like it was there, but it wasn't a selling point.
Sure.
And now I think, at a lot of times, kind of like with marginal annotations, it is the selling point.
Yeah, well, booksellers are the masters of new selling points.
Yeah, well.
So.
And I think also there shouldn't be, I'll also say that I don't think librarians and curators should be scared of booksellers. I think sometimes there is this sense of like, oh gosh, this person contacted me, they just want to sell me something. But there are times that we have just straight conversations because we both love the material.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think from my side at least, this fear or dread sometimes of dealing with booksellers, it's like, but we're all in this together because we can just like get together and like wax poetic over books. You don't have to think every time it's like, oh God, now it's going to come like an invoice.
What is your next exhibition?
My next big exhibition is going to be in the fall of 2026, and it's on the 15th century European block books, books that are fully printed in woodcut.
Like the Pauper's Bible and all.
Yeah, we have titles, the Apocalypse, the Ars Moriendi, the Biblia Pauperum, or kind of like Bible of the Poor. They're very short-lived genre in Europe that kind of began about 1450 and largely by 1480 had kind of died out because they were supplanted by typographic books, which are a lot more malleable and you can do a lot more than wooden blocks that break down quickly. We have the largest collection in America, in North America here with about 20 different copies. And so that'll be the core of the exhibition with a few loans from a couple of institutions to talk about the sort of manuscript to woodcut printing to typography, kind of transition, but more collaboration in book production at the time.
Can I get some early insight? To take the poor man's Bible, I know that's always told as being illustrative of the fact that people didn't read during the period and they needed a pure illustrated text.
Yeah.
Is that true, or is it sort of like Columbus falling off the end of the world and it was done also for other purposes?
I mean, kind of like a slight shift because it's also not, Bible of the Poor did not kind of mean economically poor. It was sort of like theologically poor, those in need of like theological understanding. And so the imagery that shows kind of a life of Christ or New Testament scene with Old Testament parallels next to it is kind of a way of understanding theology and the New Testament or the Christian interpretation of how the Old Testament relates to the New. And there is like kind of like text captions around the illustrations in kind of comic book or graphic novel fashion. But the copies that we still have and still like show provenance of where they came from, they largely were still within monasteries. So still with educated religious elite, but more for didactic purposes, again, for the members of the monasteries who needed the theological support.
Because these were expensive books even then.
Yeah, they were still cheaper than a manuscript that had to be handwritten out, but slightly more affordable, but still, yeah, fairly expensive.
Now, I know we're running out of time before the public rushes in here with their Disneyland type tickets. So I'll ask you to show one thing, or maybe if you learn a couple things here. But let's start with, if you could, wax poetically, and let's walk over to the Gutenberg Bible. Show us one of your 3 copies here.
So yes, this is our, I guess, comparatively most recent purchase for the Gutenberg Bibles. This copy is printed on paper. And Bell Green acquired this copy from Morgan about 1911. This is the 3rd Gutenberg Bible that Morgan acquired. The first one he acquired in 1896, and it's printed on vellum, but it's missing a number of pages that are in facsimile. A lot of the initials are cut out. And then he acquired in 1900 a paper copy that's just the Old Testament. It doesn't have the New Testament with it. But that copy is also, aside from being incomplete, it has some water damage. And so I think when this copy came up for auction, Bell Green was very insistent on kind of acquiring a complete, beautiful, full copy of the Gutenberg Bible for Morgan. Because it is textually complete, the paper is fantastically still bright and white. It hasn't, yellowed. No one has really messed with this copy for 500 years. It has a 19th century English binding on it from when it went through a couple of English collections through the late 18th into the 19th century. But thankfully, there was never any major restoration to the paper and the pages itself. So you still get the sense from this copy of, kind of what it would have been like 500 years ago with the bright white paper, the super dark, rich impression of the type and the black ink. And then again, you can see these initials, this large P here up at the top right, that were produced at this monastery called Kirschgarten, kind of a little bit south of Worms and Frankfurt in that region of Germany. But again, kind of as you can see here with this opening, it never looked like it was read very much. There are a few little ink marks, notations, and a few margins. But largely, this is probably more of a reference copy than something that people actually kind of went through and read.
So before we part and John disappears, I want him to make one more reappearance, and you'll see what that is in a moment. He'll explain when he reappears. Tell us what you just walked out of, John.
So as you can tell in this room, there are no external staircases to get to the upper floors. That was a very conscious decision by Pierpont Morgan and Charles McKim, the designer of the library, and I think with significant input from Bell Green as well. They didn't want staircases to block the views of the books and the shelves. And so the staircases that get you up to these 2nd and 3rd floors are actually hidden behind the bookcases themselves. These are our secret staircases.
The difference, probably, when you look around this wonderful room between the general public coming in here and a bookseller coming here is one specific thing. As soon as I came in, I noticed that there were spaces, spaces on the shelves. So those are spaces to be filled like mercury in a thermometer. So that's for all you booksellers out there. And I just wanted to say thank you, John, so much for this wonderful talk and explanation. And I hope everybody who has not visited the Morgan Library will come. And of course, we'll also visit John's next exhibition. So check out their website, follow them on Instagram, all that good stuff. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam.